The listing said, "Room for rent, one more, serious inquiries only," and Gwen Ortega was desperate enough to believe it might be real. She stood outside the address now, her breath misting in the cold October air, staring up at a building that had no business existing in the middle of downtown Chicago. It rose like something pulled from another century, all dark stone and Gothic arches, wedged impossibly between two glass-fronted office towers. The windows were tall and narrow, glowing with warm amber light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Gwen clutched her portfolio tighter against her chest and told herself she'd come this far, she might as well knock. The door opened before her knuckles touched wood. A man stood in the doorway, and Gwen's first thought was that he looked like he'd stepped out of a painting. Not a photograph, not a film painting. His skin was pale as marble, almost luminescent in the streetlight, and his hair fell past his shoulders in waves of pure white. His eyes were the color of old silver, ancient and watchful, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle, and dark trousers that looked expensive enough to pay her rent for a year at any normal apartment. "You're here about the room," he said. His voice was deep, accented with something old world that she couldn't place British, maybe, but older, like he'd learned English before it became what it was now. "Ah, yes," Gwen managed. "I called earlier. I'm Gwen Ortega. I remember." He stepped back, gesturing her inside with a graceful sweep of one long-fingered hand. "I am Henrik Falkenberg. Please, come in." The interior took her breath away. The entry hall soared 3 stories high, lined with dark wood paneling and tapestries that looked medieval. A chandelier hung overhead, dripping with crystals that caught the light and scattered it like stars. A grand staircase curved upward into shadows, its banister carved with intricate patterns of vines and roses. Everything smelled old, not musty, but old in the way library smelled, like leather and paper and time itself. "This is incredible," Gwen breathed, turning in a slow circle. "How have I never seen this building before?" "People see what they expect to see," Henrik said, closing the door behind her. "Most walk past without noticing. Only those who are looking for something find their way here." It should have sounded ominous. Instead, it sounded sad. He led her through a series of rooms that seemed to unfold like a labyrinth, a sitting room with furniture that belonged in a museum, a library with shelves that climbed to impossible heights, a dining room with a table long enough to seat 30. Finally, they climbed a narrow staircase to the 3rd floor, and Henrik opened a door onto a small but beautiful room with slanted ceilings and a dormer window that looked out over the city. "This would be yours," he said, standing in the doorway as though waiting for permission to enter. "Private bathroom through that door. You would have full access to the kitchen, the library, the gardens in the back. I ask only that you do not enter the east wing, those are my private quarters, and that you respect certain rules regarding visitors and noise after midnight." Gwen walked to the window, looking out at the glittering sprawl of Chicago. The room was bigger than her current studio apartment. The hardwood floors gleamed, and there was actual crown molding. A small bed stood in one corner, neatly made with dark blue linens, and a desk sat beneath the window perfect for painting. "Why $1?" she asked, turning to face him. "This place is Mr. Falkenberg. This is worth thousands a month at least. Why would you rent it for $1? Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "I have my reasons. Let us say that I prefer to have someone living here. And I am particular about who that someone is. The money is irrelevant. What matters is whether you will treat this house with respect and whether you will be comfortable here despite its eccentricities." "Eccentricities? I keep irregular hours," Henrik said carefully. "You will rarely see me during the day. I have business that takes me out most evenings. The house itself is old and has its quirks, pipes that groan, floors that creak, shadows that seem deeper than they should be. Some people find it unsettling." Gwen thought about her current apartment, where the heat barely worked, and her neighbor screamed at his television until 3 a.m, and last month someone had broken into the basement storage and stolen her spare canvases. She thought about her bank account, which had exactly $47 in it until her next commission payment came through. She thought about the eviction notice she'd received yesterday, giving her 2 weeks to come up with rent she didn't have. "When can I move in?" she asked. For the first time, Henrik's expression softened into something that might have been a smile. "Tonight, if you wish. I'll have the papers drawn up." The papers turned out to be a simple lease agreement, handwritten in elegant script on thick cream paper. Gwen read through it twice, looking for the catch, but it was straightforward. $1 per month, utilities included, 1-year minimum lease with option to extend. The only unusual clause was a section about household protocols that included things like no garlic in the kitchen, I have severe allergies, Henrik explained, and no opening the curtains in the east wing, and absolutely no inviting strangers into the house without Henrik's express permission. I'm very private, he said, watching her read. I hope you understand. I'm an artist, Gwen said. I basically live like a hermit anyway. This is perfect. She signed. He signed. She handed over a crumpled dollar bill from her wallet, and just like that, she had a new home. She moved in that night with everything she owned. 3 suitcases of clothes, 2 boxes of art supplies, her portfolio, and a laptop that was more duct tape than computer at this point. Henrik helped her carry everything up the stairs, moving with a fluid grace that made it look effortless, even though her boxes weighed a ton. He showed her how the antique radiator worked, where the extra blankets were kept, how to jiggle the bathroom faucet just right to get hot water. I will leave you to settle in, he said, pausing at her door. If you need anything, my study is on the 2nd floor. 3 doors down from the library. I'm often there in the evenings. Thank you, Gwen said, and meant it with her whole heart. Really, Mr. Falkenberg, you have no idea what this means to me. His silver eyes held hers for a long moment, and she had the strangest feeling that he did know, that he understood exactly what it meant to be desperate and alone and barely holding on. Then he inclined his head in an oddly formal gesture and left, closing the door silently behind him. Gwen stood in her new room and felt something unknot in her chest that had been tight for months. She fell asleep that night in clean sheets that smelled like lavender, listening to the old house settle around her like a living thing, and for the first time in years, she didn't dream about falling. The next few days passed in a strange, peaceful rhythm. Gwen woke with the sun and spent her mornings painting at the desk by her window, working on the commission pieces that paid her bills and the personal work that fed her soul. Around noon, she'd venture down to the kitchen, a massive, old-fashioned space with a gas stove and a refrigerator that looked like it belonged in a castle, and make herself lunch from the groceries she'd bought on her first full day there. The house was silent during the day, vast and empty. She explored it slowly, room by room, discovering hidden alcoves and window seats, a conservatory filled with plants that seemed to thrive despite the low light, a music room with a grand piano that looked like no one had played it in decades. She never saw Henrik. His study door remained closed, and she assumed he slept during the day, given what he'd said about keeping irregular hours. But at night, the house came alive. She first noticed it on her 3rd evening there. She'd been working late on a painting, lost in the flow of color and form, when she heard music drifting up from somewhere below. Piano music, complex and melancholy, played with the kind of skill that came from centuries of practice. Gwen set down her brush and followed the sound. She found Henrik in the music room, seated at the grand piano, his white hair falling forward to hide his face as his fingers moved across the keys. He played like it hurt, like the music was something he was pulling out of his own chest. The piece was beautiful and devastating, full of longing and loss. She must have made a sound because he stopped abruptly and looked up. In the lamplight, his skin seemed to glow, and his eyes reflected the light like an animal's. I'm sorry, Gwen said quickly. I didn't mean to interrupt. It was beautiful, I just wanted to hear better. Henrik stood, and for a moment she thought he might be angry. Then his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he gestured to a chair near the piano. Please, I'm not used to having an audience, but you're welcome to stay. She sat, curling up in the chair, and he returned to the piano. This time he played something lighter, a piece that sounded like spring and hope and new beginnings. When he finished, she clapped softly. You're incredibly talented, she said. Do you perform? Not for a very long time. Henrik's fingers rested on the keys, gentle as a caress. I used to, centuries ago. Now I play only for myself. Centuries ago. Gwen almost laughed at the exaggeration, but something in his tone made her hold back. He said it like he meant it literally. What do you do, Mr. Falkenberg? She asked. For work, I mean. Henrik, he corrected softly. Please, just Henrik, and I manage investments, mostly. Old family money that requires little active maintenance. It gives me considerable freedom with my time. Must be nice, Gwen said, then winced. Sorry, that came out bitter. I didn't mean. You're an artist, Henrik interrupted, his silver eyes finding hers. You sell your work but struggle to make ends meet. It frustrates you because you're talented, but talent alone doesn't pay bills in this world. There's no need to apologize for acknowledging that. Gwen blinked. How did you know I'm talented? You haven't seen my work. Haven't I? Henrik rose from the piano and crossed to where a painting hung on the wall, a landscape she'd been too absorbed in the piano to notice. I looked at your portfolio while you were reading the lease agreement. You have a gift for capturing light, the way it transforms ordinary moments into something transcendent. This piece, for instance. He gestured to the landscape, which Gwen now realized was one of hers, from her student days. You painted this when you were 22. You were sitting by a lake at dawn, and you were happy, truly happy perhaps, for the last time in years. She stared at the painting, her throat tight. How did you? That's not even in my portfolio. Where did you get that? I bought it, Henrik said simply. 3 years ago, from a small gallery in Boston. I saw it and knew I needed to have it. You bought my painting. Gwen stood, moving closer to look at it. She'd forgotten about this piece, had thought it lost or sold to someone she'd never know. Seeing it here, framed and cared for, made something crack open inside her chest. You've owned it for 3 years. Yes. And when I showed up here, you recognized my name. Yes. So this whole thing, the room for $1, the least you knew who I was before I got here. Henrik turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight, he looked almost inhuman in his beauty, too perfect, too pale, too still. I've admired your work for years, Gwen Ortega. When I heard through certain channels that you were struggling, that you might have to give up painting entirely, I wanted to help. I realize this may seem strange. Strange? Gwen laughed, a little wild. You bought my painting 3 years ago, tracked me down when I was about to be evicted, and offered me a room for $1 because you like my art. That's beyond strange, Henrik. I don't even know what that is. Patronage, he said quietly. In the old days, artists had patrons, wealthy individuals who supported their work so they could create without starving. I'm simply offering you that opportunity. You need a place to live and the freedom to paint. I have both to give. Is that so terrible? Put that way, it sounded almost reasonable, but there was something in his eyes, something hungry and lonely, that told Gwen this was about more than just patronage. What do you want from me? She asked. Really want, I mean. Because nobody does something like this for nothing. Henrik was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I want you to stay. I want this house to feel less empty. I want to hear another heartbeat in these halls, to know that life still exists here. I've been alone for a very long time, Gwen, and I'm tired of it. So if you're willing to tolerate an eccentric landlord who plays piano at midnight and keeps his curtains closed, I would like you to live here and paint and simply be. It was the saddest thing anyone had ever said to her. Gwen looked at this strange, beautiful man who lived in a Gothic mansion in the middle of Chicago and played Heartbreak on the piano and bought her paintings because they made him feel something. She thought about how careful he'd been with her boxes, how he'd made sure she knew where the extra blankets were, how he'd left fresh flowers in her room, that first night flowers she'd assumed were just part of the decor, but now realized he'd put there specifically for her. Okay, she said, I'll stay, and maybe sometimes I'll come listen to you play, if that's all right. The smile that broke across Henrik's face was like sunrise, brief and brilliant and worth waiting for. After that night, they fell into a rhythm. Gwen painted during the day and often ventured down after dark to find Henrik in one room or another of the vast house. They'd talk for hours about art and music, about history and philosophy, about everything and nothing. He was the most well-read person she'd ever met, able to discuss obscure Renaissance painters and ancient Greek philosophy with equal ease. He spoke a dozen languages and had traveled everywhere, though he always framed his stories in oddly formal language, as though describing things from a great distance. He never ate in front of her, she realized after the first week. He'd sit with her while she had dinner, drinking wine from a crystal glass, but she never saw him take a single bite of food. Medical condition, he explained when she finally asked. My digestion is extremely sensitive. I take my meals privately. The garlic allergy, the closed curtains in his wing, the way he only appeared after sunset. The impossible pallor of his skin, the old-fashioned way he spoke, the fact that he'd said centuries ago and seemed to mean it. Gwen wasn't stupid. She started researching late one night, sitting in her room with her laptop, typing in search terms she felt ridiculous, even considering. Vampires in Chicago. Real vampires. How to tell if someone is a vampire. The results were mostly fiction and folklore, but buried among the nonsense, she found threads on obscure forums, accounts from people who claimed to have encountered the real thing. They described creatures that were elegant and dangerous, aristocratic and predatory. Ancient beings who lived in the shadows of human society, following rules and hierarchies that predated modern civilization. They described people who looked exactly like Henrik. She should have been terrified. She should have packed her bags and run. Instead, she found herself more curious than afraid. Because Henrik, vampire or not, had been nothing but kind to her. He'd given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. He listened when she talked about her art like it actually mattered. He played piano for her at midnight and left books he thought she'd like on the table outside her door. If he was a monster, he was the gentlest monster she'd ever met. 2 weeks into her stay, Gwen came home after a rare day trip to an art supply store and found the front door ajar. Her stomach dropped. Henrik had been obsessive about keeping the house secure, about making sure doors were locked and windows were shut. He'd made her promise never to invite anyone in without asking him first, and she'd agreed, thinking it was just paranoia. Now, standing in front of that open door, she realized it might have been something else entirely. "Henrik?" she called, pushing the door wider. The entry hall was in chaos. Furniture overturned, tapestries torn from the walls, the chandelier swaying dangerously overhead. And there was blood-dark splashes of it across the floor, leading toward the east wing. Gwen's hand shook as she pulled out her phone. But before she could dial 911, she heard a sound from deeper in the house. A crash, followed by voices raised in anger. She should have run. Should have called the police and waited outside like any sensible person. Instead, she grabbed an iron poker from beside the fireplace and followed the blood. The trail led to a set of double doors she'd never seen open the entrance to Henrik's private wing. They hung crookedly now, one ripped half off its hinges. Beyond them, she could see a room that looked like a throne room from another era, all dark stone and crimson curtains and candles burning in silver sconces. And in the center of it all was Henrik. He stood surrounded by 3 figures, all of them pale and inhumanly beautiful, all of them looking at him with expressions of contempt and fury. Henrik himself was wounded. She could see the gashes across his arms, the blood staining his shirt, but he stood tall, his silver eyes blazing with an authority that made him seem 10 feet tall. "I am done with the court," he said, his voice ringing with power that raised the hair on Gwen's arms. "I abdicated. I left." "You have no authority over me here. You are still a king," one of the others hissed, a woman with black hair and eyes like rubies. "You cannot simply walk away from what you are, Henrik. The bloodlines do not forget. The court does not release. The court can rot," Henrik said flatly. "I have given you centuries. I have played your games, followed your laws, led your wars. I am finished. Find another puppet for your throne, and what will you do instead?" Another of the intruders, a man with copper hair and a cruel mouth, stepped forward. "Play house with your little mortal pet. We've been watching, Henrik. We've seen how you moon over the girl, how you pretend at domesticity. It's pathetic." "Careful, Lucien," Henrik said softly, and there was something in his voice that made the other vampire stop cold. "You forget who taught you to fight. I may be retired, but I am far from helpless." "You're sentimental," the woman said. "Weak. You've let yourself care for a human, and that makes you vulnerable." "Perhaps we should demonstrate exactly how vulnerable." She moved so fast, she seemed to simply appear in a new location right beside Gwen, who'd been frozen in the doorway. The vampire's hand closed around Gwen's throat and lifted her off her feet, and Gwen gasped, dropping the poker, clawing at fingers that felt like iron. Henrik's roar shook the house. Gwen had never seen anything move like he moved then. One moment he was across the room, wounded and surrounded. The next, he had the woman by the wrist, forcing her to drop Gwen, who crumpled to the floor gasping. Henrik twisted the woman's arm behind her back with a sickening crack and shoved her away, then stood between Gwen and the 3 intruders with his fangs bared and his eyes burning like molten silver. "Touch her again," he said in a voice that was barely human, "and I will remind you all why the court feared me in the first place." The 3 vampires exchanged glances. The woman cradled her broken arm, her ruby eyes narrow with calculation. "So it's true," she said. "You've fallen for the mortal. How deliciously tragic. Leave," Henrik said, "now, and tell the court that if they send anyone else, I will consider it an act of war." "The girl is a weakness," Lucien said, but he was backing toward the door. "Sooner or later, someone will exploit that. You know how this ends, Henrik. Get out!" They went, vanishing into the shadows with supernatural speed, and then it was just Gwen and Henrik alone in the ruined throne room. Henrik turned to her slowly, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. His fangs were still visible, his eyes still glowing with inhuman light. Blood, his own and some that belonged to the others, stained his clothes. He looked exactly like what he was, a predator, ancient and dangerous. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "You were never meant to see this, any of this." Gwen's throat hurt where the woman had grabbed her. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline making her dizzy. She looked at Henrik, really looked at him, and saw the truth written in every impossible detail, the inhuman beauty, the old world formality. The way he never appeared in daylight, never ate, never seemed to age. "You're a vampire," she said. Her voice came out hoarse, ragged, an actual vampire. Henrik closed his eyes. "Yes, And those people, those things that just attacked us, were vampires from the court. The ruling body of our kind. I used to be their king. Gwen sat down hard on a piece of overturned furniture, her legs refusing to hold her anymore. You were a king, a vampire king, and you abdicated, and they want you back, and now they're threatening you because of me. Yes. Henrik stayed where he was, several feet away, as though afraid to come closer. I am sorry, Gwen. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was selfish. I wanted to pretend, just for a little while, that I could have something normal. Something human. Is any of it real? She asked. The art patronage, the lonely landlord routine, was any of that true, or was I just some kind of game to you? Henrik's expression cracked into something raw and painful. It was real, all of it. I bought your painting because it moved me, because after centuries of darkness, you made me remember what light looked like. I offered you the room because I wanted to help you, yes, but also because I've been alone for so long that the silence was driving me mad, and he stopped, looked away. I never meant to feel this way about you. I knew it was dangerous and foolish and doomed from the start, but I couldn't help it. Feel what way? Gwen's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Henrik looked at her then, and the naked longing in his eyes stole her breath. I am falling in love with you, Gwen Ortega. Perhaps I have been since the moment I saw your painting and felt something in me come alive that I thought had died centuries ago. And that is why you're in danger now, because the court will use you against me, and I cannot bear the thought of anything happening to you. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Gwen thought about the last 3 weeks, about all the small kindnesses and late-night conversations. She thought about how Henrik listened to her talk about her art like it was the most important thing in the world, how he played piano for her like he was playing only for her, how he'd looked at her sometimes like she was something precious and impossible. She thought about how safe she'd felt here, safer than anywhere else in years. She thought about how she'd been falling, for him too, for this strange, sad, beautiful man who turned out to be something not quite man at all. I should be terrified, she said slowly. I should run screaming. You're a vampire, Henrik. You drink blood. You've lived for centuries. You're literally a different species. But all I can think about is how much I'm going to miss hearing you play piano if I leave. Henrik went very still. You're not afraid of me? Oh, I'm terrified, Gwen said. But not of you. Of them, the court. Of what they might do. Not of you, though. You've had 3 weeks to hurt me if you wanted to, and instead, you've been the kindest person I've met in years. So no, Henrik, I'm not afraid of you. You should be, he whispered. I am dangerous, Gwen. I have done terrible things in my long life. I have killed, I have conquered, I have ruled with cruelty and power. The court does not crown saints. But you left, Gwen pointed out. You walked away from all that. Why? Henrik moved to one of the tall windows, pulling aside the heavy curtain to look out at the night. The moonlight turned him into something carved from marble, beautiful and remote. Because I was tired, he said finally. Tired of the politics and the bloodshed and the endless games. Tired of existing without living. The court is ancient and proud, and its members have forgotten what it means to be anything other than predators. I ruled for 500 years, and every year I felt more hollow, more lost. So 20 years ago, I abdicated. I left the court and came here to this human city, and I have been trying to figure out how to be something other than a king ever since. 20 years alone in this house, Gwen said softly. God, Henrik. I deserved it, he said. After everything I did, isolation seemed a fitting penance, and then you arrived with your sunlight paintings, and your stubbornness and your fire, and suddenly the house didn't feel empty anymore. You made me remember what I'd been missing, what I'd been mourning all this time. What? Gwen asked. Henrik turned to face her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears that should have been impossible for a vampire. Connection, warmth, life. You painted light, Gwen, and you brought it into my darkness, and I fell in love with you for it. Gwen stood on shaky legs and crossed the room to him. Up close, she could see that his wounds were already healing, the gashes closing with supernatural speed. His fangs had retracted, leaving him looking almost human again, almost, but not quite. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the coolness of his skin, the sharp line of his jaw. I don't know how this works, she admitted. I don't know what it means to fall in love with a vampire, or how we'd even make that work. But I know that I've been happier here in 3 weeks than I've been in 3 years. I know that you make me feel seen and valued and safe. And I know that when I thought those vampires were going to hurt you, I was ready to fight them with a fire poker, which was incredibly stupid, but also kind of tells me everything I need to know about how I feel. Henrik's laugh was shaky, disbelieving. You were going to defend me with a fire poker. I told you it was stupid. It was perhaps the bravest, most foolish, most wonderful thing anyone has ever done for me." Henrik cupped her face in both hands, his touch feather-light, reverent. "You are extraordinary." "Gwen Ortega, so are you," she whispered. "Even if you are a blood-sucking creature of the night, technically, I prefer the term sanguivore," Henrik said with a hint of his old humor. Then the humor faded, replaced by worry. "But Gwen, you understand what this means, don't you? The court will not simply give up. They'll see you as leverage, as a way to force me back. Your life will be in danger as long as you stay with me. Then we'll deal with it," Gwen said firmly. "Together. Unless you're planning to dramatically brood about how it's too dangerous and try to push me away for my own good. Because I've read enough vampire romance to know that never works." Henrik blinked. "You've read vampire romance?" "I lived in a studio apartment with no TV," Gwen said. "I read everything, and I'm telling you right now, if you try the whole I'm leaving to keep you safe thing, I will hunt you down and hit you with that fire poker." "I wouldn't dream of it," Henrik said. And then he was kissing her, soft and careful like he thought she might break. His lips were cool against hers, and he tasted like wine and something darker, wilder. Gwen wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all her fear and relief and impossible affection into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Henrik rested his forehead against hers. "I will keep you safe," he promised. "No matter what the court does, I will not let them hurt you." "I know," Gwen said, and meant it. The next few days passed in a strange state of heightened awareness. Henrik had contacts throughout the city, other vampires who'd left the court or who operated on its fringes, and he reached out to all of them, gathering information, calling in favors. It turned out the vampire world was more complex than Gwen had imagined, full of factions and alliances and ancient grudges. The court was the most powerful entity, but it wasn't the only one, and there were plenty of vampires who resented its authority. Henrik had been more than just a king, she learned. He'd been a legend. Henrik Falkenberg, the Winter King, who'd ruled the northern court for 5 centuries with an iron fist and brilliant strategy, who'd never lost a battle, never shown mercy, never revealed weakness. It was hard to reconcile that image with the man who played piano at midnight and left flowers in her room. "I am not proud of who I was," Henrik told her one evening. They were in his study, surrounded by books and maps, plotting strategy like they were preparing for war. Which, Gwen supposed, they were. "I did what I thought was necessary to keep the court strong, to protect our kind from discovery and destruction, but necessity is a dangerous justification. It allows you to excuse nearly anything. You changed, though," Gwen said. She was sitting on the edge of his desk, watching him pace. "You walked away. That has to count for something, perhaps." Henrik stopped by the window, looking out at the night. "But the court does not forgive those who abandon it, especially not kings. I knew when I left that I would never truly be free of it. So what do?" Gwen asked. "We can't just hide here forever, waiting for them to make a move." "No," Henrik agreed. "We need to force the issue, to make them understand that I will not return willingly, and that threatening you will only make me an enemy they do not want. But to do that, I need to remind them of who I was, who I can still be, if pushed." He looked at her then, and there was something hard in his eyes, something cold and dangerous that reminded her he was a predator, a king, something that had survived for centuries through strength and cunning. "I am going to challenge the court," he said, formally. "There are old laws, ancient protocols for how such things are handled. If I invoke the right of contest, they will have to face me directly rather than striking at you from the shadows. And if you lose," Gwen's chest felt tight with fear. "I won't," Henrik said with absolute certainty. "I may have left the court, but I have not forgotten how to fight, and I have something now that I didn't have then, something worth fighting for." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. His skin was always cool, but his grip was steady and strong. "You make me want to be better than I was," he said quietly. "You make me remember what it means to have hope. I will not let them take that from me. I will not let them take you." Gwen squeezed his hands. "Then let's do it. Let's challenge the court and end this." The formal challenge was delivered 3 days later, carried by a neutral vampire who served as a messenger between factions. Henrik wrote it out by hand in elegant script on parchment that looked medieval, sealing it with a ring that bore his family crest, a falcon in flight over a crown of ice. The response came that same night. The court would receive Henrik's challenge, but on their terms. He was to come to their stronghold, a place called the Undercroft, hidden beneath the city, in 1 week's time. He would face the 3 council members who ruled in his absence: Seraphine of the Ruby Court, Lucian of the Copper House, and Matthias of the Shadow Line. If he could defeat all 3 in formal combat, The court would acknowledge his freedom and cease any actions against him or those under his protection. If he lost, he would return to the throne and resume his duties as Winter King. "It's a trap," Gwen said immediately when Henrik showed her the response. "They're going to cheat. They'll stack the fight against you or find some way to make it impossible to win." "Almost certainly," Henrik agreed. "But it doesn't matter. The challenge has been issued and accepted. If I back out now, I'll look weak, and they'll redouble their efforts to force my hand. This is our best chance to end the threat permanently." "Our?" Gwen raised an eyebrow. "I'm coming with you, obviously. Absolutely not." Henrik said immediately, "The Undercroft is dangerous, even for vampires. For a human, especially one they know I care about, it would be—" "I don't care," Gwen interrupted. "You're not going into this alone, Henrik. I'm coming with you, and that's not negotiable." They argued about it for hours, Henrik insisting it was too dangerous and Gwen refusing to budge. Finally, exhausted and frustrated, Henrik pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "I cannot lose you," he whispered into her hair. "You must understand that. If anything happens to you because of me, because of this cursed existence of mine, I will never forgive myself." "Then don't lose," Gwen said, pulling back to look him in the eye. "Win, and we both walk out of there together. But I am not staying behind while you risk your life, Henrik. We're in this together now." Henrik searched her face for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Together, then. But you stay close to me at all times, and if I tell you to run, you run. Promise me." "I promise," Gwen lied, because they both knew she'd never run and leave him behind. The week passed too quickly and too slowly all at once. Henrik spent his days, his nights, rather preparing, training, sparring with vampires who owed him favors and were willing to help him shake off 2 decades of rust. Gwen watched him move through forms that looked like deadly dances, all grace and power and lethal precision. He was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and she understood for the first time what it meant that he'd been a king. He fed too, though he tried to hide it from her. She caught him one evening, returning to the house with blood on his collar and guilt in his eyes. "It's okay," she told him, stopping him before he could make excuses. "I know what you are, Henrik. I know you need blood. You don't have to hide it from me." "I never take more than is freely given," Henrik said quietly. "There are those who donate willingly, who understand what we are and provide for us. I would never kill for sustenance, Gwen. Not anymore." "I know," she said, and realized she did. For all his power and predatory nature, Henrik had honor. He'd drawn lines for himself and held to them, even when it would have been easier not to. The night before the challenge, they lay together in Henrik's bed, a massive 4-poster thing that looked like it belonged in a castle. They'd been sleeping in the same room for days now, neither of them willing to be apart with the confrontation looming. Henrik held her close, running his fingers through her hair, memorizing the feel of her. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said softly, "I want you to know that these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my very long life. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to hope, to want, to live rather than merely exist. No matter what the outcome, I will be grateful for that." Gwen turned in his arms to face him. "Don't talk like you're saying goodbye. We're going to win tomorrow. You're going to beat them. And then we're coming back here. And I'm going to paint while you play piano. And we're going to figure out how this ridiculous relationship works. Okay?" Henrik's smile was sad and beautiful. "Okay," he agreed, and kissed her like it might be the last time. The Undercroft was exactly as ominous as it sounded. They entered through a hidden passage beneath an old church, descending stone stairs that seemed to go down forever into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and Gwen could feel the weight of stone and centuries pressing down from above. Torches lined the walls, burning with flames that gave off no smoke, and she could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Henrik kept her hand in his the entire way down, his grip steady and reassuring. He'd dressed formally for the occasion, in a suit that looked like it had been tailored in another century, all black with silver embroidery that caught the torchlight. His white hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp planes of his face, and his eyes glowed silver in the dimness. He looked every inch a king. The stairs finally opened onto a vast underground chamber that took Gwen's breath away. It was like a cathedral carved from living rock, with vaulted ceilings that soared into shadow and columns thick as redwoods holding up the mountain of earth above. In the center of the space stood a raised platform, and around it were gathered what looked like hundreds of vampires. They were all beautiful in that same inhuman way Henrik was, all pale skin and elegant features and eyes that reflected the light. They wore everything from modern suits to clothing that looked medieval, Renaissance, Victorian styles from across the centuries, marking them as survivors of different eras. and they all turned to look when Henrik entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to something that might have been respect. "Henrik Falkenberg," a voice called out, echoing through the chamber. "The prodigal king returns." Seraphine stepped onto the platform, her black hair falling like a curtain around her pale face, her ruby eyes fixed on Henrik with predatory intensity. Beside her appeared Lucien with his copper hair and cruel smile, and Matthias a vampire Gwen hadn't seen before, massive and scarred, with eyes like chips of ice. "I return only to leave again," Henrik said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the space. "I have issued challenge, and you have accepted. Let us finish this." "So eager," Lucien said. "But there are formalities to observe. You bring a human into the Undercroft, Henrik. That requires explanation." "She is under my protection," Henrik said, flatly. "Where I go, she goes. This is not negotiable." "How domestic," Seraphine said. "You risk everything for a mortal who will be dust in the blink of an eye. Have you truly fallen so far, Henrik?" "I have risen," Henrik corrected, his voice sharp as a blade. "I was lost, drowning in darkness, and she pulled me back to the light." "Do not mistake love for weakness, Seraphine. You of all people should know better." Something flickered across Seraphine's face pane, quickly hidden. Gwen filed that away as potentially important information. "The challenge stands," Matthias rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. 3 against 1, combat to yield or incapacitation. You win, you're free. You lose, you take back the crown. Are you prepared to begin?" "One moment," Henrik said. He turned to Gwen, pulling her close, speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. "Stay at the edge of the platform. Do not interfere no matter what you see. They will fight with honor because the court laws demand it. But if you step onto the platform, those laws no longer apply. Do you understand?" Gwen nodded, her throat tight. Henrik kissed her forehead, then released her and stepped onto the platform. The 3 council members spread out, circling him. Henrik stood in the center, perfectly still, watching them all with the patient intensity of a predator. "Begin," Seraphine said, and attacked. The fight was nothing like the movies. It was faster, more brutal, almost too quick for Gwen's human eyes to follow. Seraphine moved like liquid shadow, striking from impossible angles. Lucien fought with vicious elegance, all sharp edges and cruel precision. Matthias was raw power, every blow capable of shattering bone, and Henrik met them all. He moved like violence made beautiful, like every motion was calculated and perfect. He caught Seraphine's wrist and used her momentum to throw her into Lucien. He ducked under Matthias's haymaker and drove an elbow into the larger vampire's ribs hard enough that Gwen heard something crack. He fought like he'd been doing it forever, because he had centuries of combat distilled into pure skill. But he was outnumbered, and they were all ancient and powerful in their own right. Lucien's claws raked across Henrik's back, shredding his jacket and the flesh beneath. Matthias got hold of him and slammed him into the stone platform hard enough to crack it. Seraphine's fangs found his shoulder, and she tore away a chunk of flesh before Henrik could throw her off. Gwen bit down on her fist to keep from screaming, from running onto the platform to help. She could see Henrik's blood, dark as ink in the torchlight, staining the stone. Could see him growing slower, his movements losing their perfect precision. He was losing. "Yield," Seraphine said, circling him. All 3 council members were wounded. Lucien's arm hung at an odd angle. Matthias was limping. Seraphine's ribs were clearly broken, but Henrik was worse. He was on one knee, breathing hard, blood dripping from a dozen wounds. "You fought well, Henrik, but it's over. Yield and take your throne. It's where you belong." "No," Henrik said through gritted teeth. He forced himself to stand, swaying but upright. "I belong with her, in the light, not down here in the dark with you." "Then you'll die down here," Lucien said, and lunged. Henrik caught him mid-leap, using his own momentum to spin him around and snap his neck. It wouldn't kill him. Vampires were harder to kill than that, but it put him down. Matthias roared and charged, and Henrik met him head-on, and the sound of their collision was like thunder. They went down in a tangle, both of them fighting with desperate fury. Henrik's fangs found Matthias's throat, and he tore, and suddenly there was blood everywhere. Matthias's struggles weakened, then stopped. Henrik rose, shaking, and turned to face Seraphine. She stood alone now, her council members down, her ruby eyes wide with something that might have been fear or might have been respect. "Just you and me," Henrik said softly. "The way it was in the beginning, before I made you council. Before everything went wrong between us. You left me," Seraphine whispered. "You were my king, my partner, and you just walked away." "I left the court," Henrik corrected gently. "Not you, Seraphine." "Never you specifically. But I couldn't stay, couldn't keep being what the throne demanded. I'm sorry I hurt you." "You loved me once," she said. "I did," Henrik agreed, "and part of me always will. But that was a long time ago, and we were different people then." I've changed. I want different things now. Her, Seraphine said, looking past Henrik to where Gwen stood frozen at the platform's edge. You want her. A human. I want life, Henrik said. I want warmth and hope and light. She gives me those things. Can you understand that? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lowered her hands. I yield, she said quietly. The challenge is yours, Henrik. You're free. The chamber erupted in noise, vampires shouting, arguing, some applauding. Henrik stood swaying on the platform, blood-soaked and victorious, and his eyes found Gwen's across the chaos. She ran to him, ignoring protocol and safety, and he caught her as she jumped onto the platform. His arms closed around her, and she could feel him shaking with exhaustion and pain. You did it, she said against his chest. You won. We're free. We're free, Henrik echoed, and then his legs gave out. Gwen half-carried. Half dragged him off the platform as the vampire crowd surged closer, curious and dangerous. Seraphine appeared beside her, and Gwen tensed, but the vampire woman just grabbed Henrik's other arm. Come, Seraphine said. I'll help you get him out of here. He needs blood and rest. Together, they got Henrik up the endless stairs and out into the night. Dawn was coming. Gwen could see the sky lightening to the east, and Henrik's skin was starting to smoke faintly in the pre-dawn light. My car, Seraphine said, gesturing to a black sedan. Get him in. I'll drive you home. Gwen helped Henrik into the back seat, climbing in after him and pulling his head onto her lap. He looked terrible pale even for him, his wounds still bleeding sluggishly. But he was alive, and they'd won. Seraphine drove through the empty pre-dawn streets while Gwen held Henrik and whispered reassurances. When they pulled up in front of the Gothic mansion, Seraphine turned to look at them. He really loves you, she said quietly. I've known Henrik for 400 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. I love him too, Gwen said. Seraphine nodded slowly. Then take care of him. He deserves happiness, even if he couldn't find it with me. She hesitated, then added, If the court gives you trouble, send word. I'll make sure they leave you alone. Thank you, Gwen said, meaning it. They got Henrik inside just as the sun broke over the horizon, flooding the city with light. Gwen pulled all the curtains closed and half carried Henrik to his bed. His wounds were already starting to heal. Vampire regeneration was remarkable, but he needed blood to speed the process. There's a refrigerator, Henrik managed to say, his voice weak. In the basement, medical storage. Bring me 2 bags. Gwen found the basement, which turned out to be a small medical suite that would have looked at home in a hospital, and the refrigerator stocked with bags of blood. She grabbed 2 and ran back upstairs. Henrik drank directly from the bags, and Gwen watched color slowly return to his face as his wounds closed. By the time he finished the second bag, he looked almost normal again, just exhausted. Come here, he said, holding out a hand. Gwen climbed onto the bed beside him, and he pulled her close, wrapping around her like he needed the contact to believe she was real. We did it, he whispered into her hair. We're actually free. We are, Gwen confirmed, though I'd like to never do anything that terrifying again if it's all the same to you. Henrik's laugh was weak but genuine. Agreed. From now on, just quiet nights and piano music and watching you paint. That's all I want. That sounds perfect, Gwen said. They lay there as the sun rose higher, light trying to seep through the heavy curtains, and Gwen felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of home. I love you, she said. I probably should have mentioned that before you went to fight 3 vampire council members, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Henrik Falkenberg. Henrik pulled back just enough to kiss her, soft and sweet and full of promise. I love you too, Gwen Ortega. My light. My life. My home. Outside, the city woke up, humans going about their normal days, never knowing what had transpired in the darkness beneath their feet. And in a Gothic mansion that shouldn't exist, a vampire king who'd given up his crown and the artist who'd given him back his heart slept wrapped in each other's arms, safe at last. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Gwen's life. Henrik healed completely within days, his supernatural constitution repairing the damage from the challenge with remarkable speed. They fell back into their routine Gwen painting during the day, Henrik emerging at dusk to make her dinner or play piano while she worked late into the night. But there were changes too. Henrik taught her about his world, about vampire politics and history, and the strange rules that govern their society. She learned that vampires had been around for millennia, that they'd shaped human history from the shadows, that the court system kept them organized and hidden. She learned about bloodlines and houses, about old feuds and ancient alliances. And Henrik learned about her world, the human world, he'd mostly observed from a distance for 20 years. She dragged him to art galleries and coffee shops, to late-night diners and midnight movie screenings of terrible horror films that made him wince at the inaccurate vampire portrayals. "We do not sparkle," he said with great dignity during one particularly egregious film, and Gwen had laughed so hard she'd snorted coffee. They built a life together, strange and unconventional but theirs. Henrik set up a studio for Gwen in one of the mansion's many rooms, a space with huge windows that could be opened during the day and closed at night when he joined her. Her paintings took on new dimensions, richer shadows and more complex light, as though his presence had unlocked something in her art. She started selling more work, her reputation growing through galleries that Henrik quietly had connections to. The money was better than she'd ever dreamed, and when she tried to pay him more rent, he'd refused. "You're not a tenant," he'd said, pulling her into his arms. "You're my partner, my love. This is your home too now. So what does that make me?" Gwen had asked. "Your vampire king girlfriend? Former vampire king," Henrik had corrected with a smile. "And yes, I suppose that's exactly what you are." 3 months after the challenge, on a cold January night, Henrik took Gwen up to the roof of the mansion. She'd never been up there before, hadn't even known it was accessible, but there was a widow's walk that looked out over the entire city. "I have something for you," Henrik said. He pulled a small box from his pocket old wood, carved with intricate patterns, and opened it to reveal a ring. The band was silver, set with a stone that seemed to hold its own light, pale blue like ice or frozen starlight. "This was my mother's," Henrik said quietly. "One of the few things I kept from my human life before I was turned. I've carried it for 700 years, waiting for someone worth giving it to." Gwen's breath caught. "Henrik, I know we've only known each other a few months," he continued, "and I know that by human standards that's incredibly fast, but I've lived long enough to recognize something precious when I find it. You are my light, Gwen. You are what makes eternity worth living, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my existence with you, if you'll have me." "Yes," Gwen said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, of course, yes." Henrik slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, the stone glowing brighter against her skin. Then he kissed her, deep and passionate and full of forever, and Gwen kissed him back and thought about how strange and wonderful it was that her life had led here to a rooftop in Chicago, in the arms of a vampire king, with a ring that had survived centuries to find her finger. "There is one thing we should discuss," Henrik said when they finally broke apart. "The matter of your mortality." Gwen had known this conversation was coming. She'd thought about it a lot over the past months, about what it meant to love someone who would live forever while she aged and died. "I don't want to be turned," she said carefully. "Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever. I like being human, Henrik. I like daylight and food and all the messy, complicated parts of being mortal. I don't want to give that up." "I would never ask you to," Henrik said immediately. "Your humanity is part of what I love about you. But you should know that there are options, ways to extend human life without full conversion. Blood bonds, for instance. If you drink from me regularly, it would slow your aging significantly. Not stop it entirely, but you could live for centuries rather than decades." "Centuries with you?" Gwen asked. "If you want them." She thought about it, looking out over the city lights. A normal human life was 70, 80, maybe 90 years if she was lucky. Henrik was offering her hundreds of years, time enough to create more art than she'd ever dreamed possible, to travel the world, to be with him. "Let's start with the blood bond," she said, "and we can figure out the rest as we go. I just know I don't want to lose you, and I don't want you to have to lose me." "Then you won't," Henrik promised. "I will keep you with me for as long as you wish to stay, in whatever form makes you happy." They were married in the spring, in a ceremony that blended human and vampire traditions. Seraphine came, civil if not warm, and brought with her a delegation from the court who presented gifts and formally recognized Henrik's freedom. Lucien and Matthias even made appearances, both healed from their challenge wounds, and while they weren't exactly friendly, they were respectful. Gwen's few friends from her art school days attended, confused by the venue, the Gothic mansion that they'd somehow never noticed before, and charmed by Henrik, who played the gracious host with centuries of practice. They had no idea they were attending a wedding where half the guests were vampires, and Gwen decided that was probably for the best. The ceremony itself was at midnight, because Henrik couldn't exactly do a daytime wedding. They exchanged vows under the stars in the mansion's garden, which had bloomed into impossible beauty for the occasion. Henrik wore black and silver, looking every inch the king he'd been, and Gwen wore a dress the color of moonlight that Seraphine had given her as a wedding gift. "I promise to love you in darkness and in light," Henrik said, his silver eyes bright with emotion, "to be your shelter and your home, to honor your humanity and protect your dreams." For all the days you give me, and beyond, I promise to be your light, Gwen said, her voice strong despite the tears on her cheeks. To love you not despite what you are, but because of it. To build a life with you that honors both our worlds. For as long as my heart beats and beyond. They sealed it with a kiss, and the vampire guests made a sound like wind through trees approval, acceptance, joy while the humans applauded, none of them knowing they'd just witnessed something that almost never happened. A vampire king truly finding his happily ever after. The years that followed were full and rich. Gwen's art career flourished, her work showing in galleries around the world. Henrik traveled with her when he could, and she learned which cities had strong vampire presences where he could find shelter from the sun. They became known in both the human art world and the vampire court, the artist, and her mysterious benefactor, though only the vampires knew the full truth. Gwen drank from Henrik once a month, the blood bond keeping her young and healthy long past when she should have started aging. She didn't look a day over 25, even as the years piled up 30, 40, 50 years with Henrik. She painted him 1,000 times, trying to capture the way light and shadow played across his features, the ancient soul visible in his silver eyes. They had adventures, too. Trips to vampire strongholds in Europe, where Henrik introduced her to ancient beings who'd known him as king. A terrifying week in Tokyo, dealing with a rogue vampire who didn't recognize Henrik's freedom and had to be dealt with. A beautiful summer in Iceland where the midnight sun meant Henrik could walk outside for weeks at a time, his face turned up to the light he so rarely got to feel. And through it all, they had the mansion their home, their sanctuary. The place where Gwen painted and Henrik played piano, and they built a life that shouldn't have been possible but was, 75 years after Gwen first knocked on the door of that impossible house. She sat in her studio putting final touches on a painting. She was 95 years old by the calendar, but looked 50 at most, the blood bond keeping her healthy and strong. Her hair had finally started to go silver, matching Henrik's, and he'd told her she'd never been more beautiful. The painting was of the night they'd met the Gothic mansion rising between modern buildings, a young woman with a portfolio standing at the door, a pale figure visible in the doorway. She'd been working on it for months, trying to capture the feeling of that moment when her life had changed forever. Henrik appeared in the doorway of the studio, moving with that fluid grace that still took her breath away after all these years. He looked exactly as he had the night they'd met, unchanged. Unchanging, eternal. "It's finished," Gwen said, setting down her brush. He came to stand behind her, his cool hands resting on her shoulders as they both looked at the painting. "It's magnificent," he said softly. "You've captured it perfectly, that moment when everything changed. I was so desperate," Gwen said, "so scared and alone. And then you opened the door, and suddenly I had hope again." "You gave me hope too," Henrik said. He turned her chair so she faced him, then knelt before her, a vampire king kneeling before his mortal wife, something that would have shocked the court if they could see it. "You gave me everything, Gwen. A reason to exist, a way to live instead of merely surviving. I love you more now than I did the day we met. And I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." "Forever?" Gwen asked, smiling through the tears that came so easily these days. "Forever," Henrik promised, and in that moment, in a studio full of light and color, with the city glittering beyond the windows and a vampire's arms around her, Gwen knew that she had found exactly what she'd been searching for all those years ago, when she'd answered an impossible listing for a room that cost $1. She'd found home. She'd found love. She'd found forever. And it had all started with a knock on a door and a lonely king who'd needed light as much as she'd needed shelter. They stayed there for a long time, wrapped in each other, while the sun set and the stars came out, and the house settled around them like a living thing, their sanctuary, their haven, their happily ever after made real through impossible love and stubborn hope. Gwen's art would hang in museums for centuries, her name remembered long after she was gone. Henrik would carry her memory for eternity, his heart finally full after so many empty years. But that was all distant future, abstract and uncertain. What mattered was now this moment, this love, this life they'd built together against all odds. And so they stayed, the broke artist and the lonely vampire king, in their Gothic mansion that existed between worlds, living proof that even the darkest souls could find light and that love, real love, could bridge any divide, even the one between mortal and immortal, human and vampire, darkness and light. They lived happily ever after, in their own impossible way, for all the days Gwen had and all the nights that followed. And that, in the end, was more than either of them had ever dared to hope for when Gwen first knocked on that door and Henrik first opened it to let her in. It was enough. It was everything. It was forever.